This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 6, Character Growth in the Roll With It system. Hello friends and welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I am Chris Krueger and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Bracken.
Hey everybody.
And this is part of our continuing series on the Roll With It system, our commentary on how it works and how it's played. And today we're discussing character growth. Now this is kind of the follow-up, if you will, to character creation, where you have a concept and you know sort of what sort of character you want to play. This is kind of addressing how you play them and also where you take them throughout the course of the story. And even during the conceptual phase, you might have a sort of idea of my character's going to start off this way and become this, or maybe you surprise yourself with as things happen in the story, maybe you take it in a different direction, that sort of thing. But we're talking about kind of how you do that.
I want to be a paladin, so I should stop murdering people.
It's probably a good start.
Yeah.
And so a big part of this is thinking about when you open scenes or when you enter scenes, you know, the motifs obviously that you're playing are going to play into what you're doing, but thinking about in almost like a strategic sense, when do I play which cards in order to develop my character in this moment? Because in a way, you don't necessarily get to open a scene right when you think it would be best for you to open a scene because you might not have the most cards of anyone at the table.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to kind of take advantage of the time you were given, which might not be the time you were expecting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sometimes you just need to buy into somebody else's scene, accepting that this episode is not about you.
Mm-hmm.
You are the secondary character, you're the backup character, you're the buddy, you're the whatever, and then sort of plan ahead. And then the next time, the in-between time comes, what you end up doing is you make that decision. I'm not going to put a star on a card. I'm going to get a new card, so I have more cards, so that I can maybe highlight in a future episode, that kind of a thing. And you start really thinking in terms long term of the new stuff that I'm adding. I'm going to enrich my character with new cards rather than powering up the cards that I have. And so in the beginning, whenever you're thinking about what kind of character do I want to create, how many cards do I want that character to have, you're really setting yourself up if you choose just to have the 3 cards and someone else is choosing to have 5 to be, the powerful character in the background. And so over the course of, first of all, the failures, where you put stars on cards, because you never get new cards from failure. You always get stars from failure. And so if you allow the failures to power up your cards and you let the in-between re-upping
the one star you get between episodes.
Yeah, the between episode star is what I'm talking about. You throw that on a new card that's a 0. That's how you can really increase your
screen
presence.
Yes.
Yeah, your screen presence.
And as we've said in a previous episode, sometimes what you put on those new cards is going to be defined by things that have happened in the story or a place you want to take your character in the story, given what you've been seeing, how it's been shaping up. There's those moments when you come up with something where you think, oh, this would be really cool to have my character do or to sort of like bring up. But then just that circumstance hasn't really presented itself. And you have a hard time finding ways to apply that one. So maybe you just sort of put that aside, you focus on a new card that is more relevant, and then either you bring that other one back in when it becomes interesting, or you find a way to abandon it and to sort of cycle that out and to come up with more stuff that's a little bit more relevant to the story you're telling.
Well, there is a bit of a story hack, and it's that you can always choose to self-assist by hindering yourself and then immediately abandon the hindrance. And that's just literally a way to burn a card forever. And if it's an interesting narrative element in it, it's actually kind of a cool little move, and it's a great way to free up a card slot or something like that. It ends up being sort of a net zero on what you end up doing mechanically, but it can really impact a story narratively.
Right. And I personally find that I like, I mentioned making your new cards relevant to the story that you're telling, but also reflecting in a way what has happened so far. So it just is an example from the game that we're currently playing at the time of recording. My character in the first episode ends up kind of breaking his arm in a car crash. And
madman.
when I got a new card in the next episode, I made that card called Slings and Arrows. Because I'm in a sling.
Love the pun. Love the pun.
My arm is in a sling, and I can also use that card to kind of speak generally about trials and tribulations and stuff like that.
Right.
But I reflected a narrative thing that is now kind of, in a sense, solidified mechanically because it's on one of my cards.
Exactly.
Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that just because you have things on your cards that are prompting you to play a certain way or to portray your character a certain way, we don't want you to think that you have to have something on a card for it to come out in the narrative.
Exactly.
This is the section in the book that we call You're More Than Your Motifs.
Yes.
It's one of our sidebars where we're talking about how you define your character and how there are things that if you could just get a good idea in the middle of an episode that's maybe unexpected, that's taking you in a direction you weren't planning on, that it's not reflected in your cards, you should just run with it because you can always add it to cards later. But even if you don't, say even, for example, that you abandon something that you used to have, that doesn't mean that it's gone forever. It just means that your character was changed by it. Right. So, there's still, like, say, for example, I've got a motif that is a career path, essentially. So I'm a soldier. And I abandoned soldier because I'm kind of like giving up that life. That doesn't mean that my years of training and experience went away. Right. It just means that I'm approaching things differently. So I can still draw on my experience as a soldier narratively, even though I don't have that card in my hand anymore. Exactly.
And it'll be important and it'll come out, I guess, narratively, because mechanically you won't be able to throw that, let's call it a 2-star card down and open scenes with it or assist with that anymore. You can still narratively describe how that comes into play. And of course, you'll have other motifs as well. And if you've built the character sort of around that idea of being a vet or whatever, you probably have other stuff that relates to that. Right. So it's still going to be the same character. My favorite line in all of the rules, and I know you wrote this, Chris, but my favorite line is, motifs are not containers that permit you to say or do certain things. They're icons that evoke the person they signify. And that's just beautiful. I think that's that really captures the spirit of the game at its heart and soul. That's what the characters are. It's an idea in your head first. And that's what that character is, first and foremost. Mechanically, you play motifs down and cards down that have star value and all of that, and you can influence the scenes. But really, it comes down to, I know who this character is and who this guy is, and that's how I'm playing it.
And so that kind of ties into we mentioned already in a way, you have your character concept, but then as part of that concept, you have where I'm taking my character. And so this brings me a little bit into how, in a practical sense, you can characterize and how you can portray that character to help the audience, whether that audience is, your fellow players and the GM, or if it's the proverbial audience we mentioned in previous episode, how we like to sort of think of it like a show or like we're writing a book or something like that, where in this scene, we're establishing this for the audience where they wouldn't know it if we didn't do this. So how do you practically play cards, and how do you practically portray your character scene to scene to establish who they are? And then how do you over time kind of evolve the character? What can you do in the game to show that they're changing into something?
Well, my quick answer to that is the party mentality. I mean, the idea behind who I am and who I'm becoming as a character in the system is always going to be informed by the setting. It's always going to be informed by the tone, but ultimately it's also going to be informed by the stories that we are collectively telling together. It's like a multi-stranded braid on a rope. All the character arcs together are weaving in and out, and that's what that's going to become. So if you end up going completely on left field, flipping out, becoming the antagonist, that kind of a thing, it's a little strange, disconcerting, and it might even kind of, it has the potential to break a game if as a player you go completely off into left field, as every GM knows when they're like, do you go left? Do you go right? And the player goes, I blast a hole through the wall and go straight. You're like, no. and I think we've given in this system players more freedom to explore those kinds of ideas in a completely open and nonlinear way. To use the correct term, it would be, an ergodic system in that it's completely open-ended and very, very human and feels very natural and that kind of a thing. But, when you're talking about changing a character, evolving a character, I think a lot of it has to do with when you create a new motif. I think that's the most powerful moment in the game in character evolution.
Would you say even more so than abandoning or epiphanying?
Well, in a way, yes, but you got to also understand that abandoning and epiphanying is really about the same thing. It's about changing the cards that you have. So I guess what I'm really saying is changing the cards that you have is, I think, more powerful than changing the value of the cards that you have. Having a 2-star card versus having a 1-star card, I think, is not nearly as powerful as adding a whole new motif into your hand, even at 0 value. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that, since you're going to cap at 6, you really have to ask, what are the 6 most important things about my character that encapsulate who that character is at this phase in the story? Let's say that it's episode 4. If you have the same 6 motifs in episode 4, well, let me put it a different way. If you have the same 6 motifs in episode 8 that you did in episode 4, your character's on kind of a slow burn because you haven't abandoned anything. You haven't epiphanied anything. You haven't changed anything. And you sort of rushed to get there in the first place. So you ended up with 6 cards. And then it sounds like probably, I would guess, what you're doing is you're building up the power of those cards. By episode 9 or 10, as a GM personally, I'd make sure that you had some kind of a situation where you had to change something. I would force you into a critical decision, kind of like we talked about in the last episode. But ultimately, it is each player's power and governance to decide how they're going to evolve that character. Well, you mentioned abandoning and epiphanying. Let's talk about those. We haven't talked about those at all, and yet they are a incredibly important and critical part of the system. Let's start with why those exist.
Yeah, well, I think that on a mechanical level, and this is a sort of philosophical loan, if you will, from the Murder Your Darling system, which we talked about in episode 0, the another game that we've been working on, where we wanted to build into the system something that encourages players to grow their characters.
Yeah. And that's a diced system. And this is a diceless system.
And not just to grow their characters in a sort of traditional RPG sense, if they become more powerful or more experienced, or they get more spells, or they're better at what they do, but grow them in a narrative sense of they are changing, they're evolving. Because I think that in a way you could sort of say that all stories are about characters and how they change.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different one line stories are blank. And I think that ultimately they're all kind of related.
Yeah.
You might be phrasing it a different way. Another way to say that might be, for example, that all stories are about transformation, that in some way, shape, or form, you have a status quo and then something happens that starts to change it, whether it's whether someone's intending to change or whether being sort of forced to change to react to it. And then by the end of it, they have changed.
Yes.
And so we wanted to build this in. The way we're doing it is to kind of, in a sense, force, but, force makes it sound, bad potentially. But what we're trying to do is encourage the churn. We're trying to make it so that you max out your hand, that you can't take advantage of any new stars you're getting. And epiphanies and abandonments are the way in which you can get a card out of your hand and to change your character by adding, making room for a new card. But we encourage you to do that because we give it a mechanical benefit as well.
Yes.
So when you epiphany, you automatically win the scene. And often it's kind of like players like to do sort of like this really cool moment when they do it, kind of like an ultimate move almost that they've been sort of leading up to.
Yeah.
And Roll With It Season 4, Jim, who we've talked about before, was playing this character who's like the 80s guy, and he's always riding around on this light bike. And so his epiphany was that he brings out this secret sort of ability of the bike that he hasn't talked about so far. It turns into like the sort of robot suit, and he kind of turns into this robot warrior. And so that's one way we can approach an epiphany. An epiphany can also, though, be just kind of like a a narrative thing that happens. It's a realization. It's a change of heart or of mind. I recommend you go and sort of, if you don't already have a familiar with sort of like the literary concept of Epiphanies, maybe doing some searching on that on Google to sort of see if anything gives you ideas, because it can also indicate what the audience or what other characters might see as a negative thing. It's not always a positive thing when your character changes by an epiphany. So in giving it the sort of mechanical benefit of winning the scene automatically, or maybe reducing the GM's obstacles such that you can win, and combining that with having a very specific narrative effect, it's of course going to change depending on the circumstances of what the motif is. But the fact that we say that it has to have a narrative impact as well as a mechanical one kind of lets you build these moments into the story.
Yeah. And that's on the player side. I guess it's worth mentioning. There's never necessarily a narrative reason for the GM to have to play a card. You don't have to work that in. But in order to abandon something that the GM has played, which is of course when you do it, that does have to have narrative impacts. So that's kind of interesting. But it's worth mentioning, just from a meta standpoint, that if the GM has the card in their hand, that's because at some point in the episode, you played it.
Right.
So it actually did have a narrative impact in the episode 1, 2, 3 or scenes, 1, 2 or 3 scenes prior.
Yeah. And that was very intentional.
Yeah, it was. And so it's not, even if you don't even just mention it, the abandonment feels natural because it was something that was played earlier in the episode to get you to where you are now.
There's a bit of a setup and payoff that's sort of built into it naturally.
Yeah. And so that's incredibly fun to experience in that sort of a thing. And as I said in the last episode, as a GM, I like teasing the player with that and putting it out there. I'm okay with losing a scene if it means that the players had to sacrifice something through an abandonment. I'm completely okay with that because it's great story. It's great story.
And so kind of going back a little bit to that question I posed a little while ago about, like, in a practical sense, how do you establish who your character is and how do you show them changing? And I think a lot of this comes down to what you do narratively with your mechanical moves. And this is another thing we said in the rule book, that we really encourage you to have a beat. And a beat, by this we mean kind of like in a sort of screenwriting sense of there are multiple beats in a scene. There's a thing that happens that kind of indicates a change in kind of what's going on in the scene. So you have a number of beats that make up the full scene.
Yeah.
And so whenever you play a card, that indicates that you're doing something mechanically. And the choice you make, like what it is that you're doing when you play that card, is going to be a big part of how you characterize.
That's right.
The choice you make as far as what it means to enter a card and to define your angle when you enter someone else's scene. The narrative thing that you do whenever you play that card mechanically tells us about your character. And in that particular case, it's helping to define your character in the context of other characters and what they're doing. So whether you're going up against them, that tells you something about your character by the contrast. Or if you're helping them, we learn something about your character because you are sort of in agreement with them, or maybe for other reasons. And you can define this through the role play. Maybe you disagree with them, but ultimately you want some greater good or something like that. It all sort of depends on the context. So sort of attaching a narrative, if you think of it in a sense like the exterior shell on the guts of a machine, maybe like, the exterior body of a car, and underneath that is under the hood, you got the engine and all the gears and the wheels and stuff like that,
right?
That make it go. That's the mechanics, but the exterior, what we see, is the narrative you attach to it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a great way to say it. Well, and I think that there's a lot to be said for the choices that you make as you write your motifs, and also as you play your motifs. For example, an okay motif would be my samurai sword, right? Okay, that's kind of interesting. Unless, of course, the setting is the spaceship. And then suddenly that same exact motif has become way more interesting. It's even more interesting if it's my father's samurai sword, because then it's like, oh, well,
you got some backstory attached to this.
Yeah, literally without anything at all. It's just that word father's, no pun intended, impregnates the card and makes it more meaningful. So then you get to that moment where you've attacked the guy with my father's samurai sword, and win or lose, then in the next scene, that sword comes back out from the GM, and you're like, you're still holding the sword narratively, obviously. I mean, your character's still sword fighting, but if you're like, I am willing to break my sword, my father's samurai sword, let it, go off into space or whatever it is that happens. I'm gonna abandon it on Ganymede. Whatever it is that moment is. That's important because that means it's gone forever. And yet you could flip side that and still have it be where the meaning behind the sword is lost. And maybe you keep the sword physically, but I'm going to, I'm going to let that shift so that the sword becomes a dark totem for me.
Or like you said, like, I'm never going to wield this sword again.
Right, exactly.
And yet you still have it physically. So it's kind of like this constant, maybe a temptation for your character, maybe a constant reminder of why you gave it up or something like that.
Yeah, because you regret, maybe you kill him and you regret it or something like that. Then do the opposite, or the flip side, which is the Epiphany, assuming that the sword is a 3-star card, which of course it would have to be. It's your father's samurai sword. That's totally the one I would get up to 3 stars. But maybe you Epiphany it and you're like, but I don't want to tear that card because I want my samurai sword. I don't ever, what? No. Epiphany the sword. And then whenever you get your free star and you're in between episodes, actually create a card then that represents still having the sword, right, but it's now transcended into something way cooler, such as, I now have absolution with my father. And so you still have the sword narratively, but the sword is not the card you play. You've epiphanied what that sword was, and now it's become something else. And so maybe you go with Weapons Master or just, and so that's the thing, is that the cards don't represent the physical item necessarily. You can actually have the sword break and still continue to play the sword because what you're playing is, that's the jerk that stole my sword. Not, okay, I'm going to take my sword and play my sword because I have my sword. Don't be so literal with it. That's the kind of thing I think that makes character growth really impactful in the system.
And I think that leads me into something that we can sort of talk about to start winding this down. Anticipating epiphanies and abandonments in order to sort of like, if there's no other way that you enact change, and I think that there are a lot of ways through the role play, and I won't get into right now exactly how you might do that, but you can sort of indicate that your character is changing by the way that the context around your motifs changes. And we talked about it on a previous episode, even how there's more meaning attached to this motif because it's appeared in scene 17 and scene 25.
Just for the proverbial audience, it becomes more meaningful. Even if you don't really do anything new with it, it now has new context.
Exactly. And so when you build your character and you're thinking about character growth, you might kind of go into it knowing like, I want this card to be my 3-star that I'll eventually epiphany, or I'm anticipating that I'm probably going to abandon this card or something like that. And it's really great to have that idea, but we would also encourage you to be flexible in that.
Absolutely.
There's a concept that we've mentioned before, the Murder Your End Darling system, another one of our games. And
it stands for narrative. He just doesn't believe it.
The concept of murdering your darlings in writing is actually the source of that name.
Yeah.
And it's a philosophy that you can apply to this as well, even though it's not that system technically. But what it basically means in the sort of writer's sense is to let go of those like really pretty lines that you wanted to have. Like maybe you go into a story where like, I want to have this moment, and no matter where else the story goes, this moment's going to happen. Or even just like how you wrote it itself. Like it doesn't feel very natural, it feels stilted, it doesn't fit with anything else, but you really want to describe this thing this way. And Murdering Your Darlings is a really good approach for improving your writing because you don't have all these things you sort of shoehorned, if that makes sense. The other way we like to use it though, and especially in Mind, the other system, is in a slightly more literal sense, if your character is your darling, doing really bad things to them. And this is the idea of, when you get a chance to describe how your character fails a scene, for example, not being afraid to think of your character like you are. In role-playing games, you are your character in a lot of ways. But you also need to think of it almost as a writer. You need to sort of detach yourself a little bit sometimes to say, what is best for my character's story and the story arc that we're in the middle of right now, and kind of volunteer in a way really bad stuff to happen. So just as one random example, and there's so many possible examples,
aren't there?
I have my arm in a sling, and that's going to affect my story moving forward. But I volunteered that because it would be something narratively interesting, a visual reminder of something that happened that could add complications later in the season. I did that not because the system said, okay, if this happens and you roll whatever on this table, you get a broken arm. So a big part of kind of doing things that are interesting in the narrative is kind of letting your character really feel the pain, so to speak, of failures.
Yeah.
And then letting that enrich the story.
Yeah. And that's how the character evolves, which is really what character growth is all about. It's about deciding how that character is going to change. And that's really what rich storytelling is about. It's about character change, learning something.
And as a final note, you mentioned earlier the party mentality and how someone becomes like, the anti-hero and goes against the rest of the party, how that could like really derail the story you're telling.
It can.
And that's also going to depend on your group. I would argue, though, that if you have a good group and you sort of do it thoughtfully and tastefully, you can actually have that be a really interesting thing narratively.
That's absolutely true.
Because it's totally possible to have a story in which all the different players aren't all on the same side.
Yeah.
They can each be kind of like doing their own thing, and each of the scenes is kind of like, okay, now will this character get what they want? Will this character get what they want? And that sort of brings me to like a final point here of being willing to collaborate with the GM, either at the beginning of a season or maybe sometime like further into the season, once you've sort of figured out what's going on, you get some new ideas. You can go and talk to the GM about, hey, here's where I'm thinking I might want my character to go. And then maybe some secret that they have that you like to reveal over time.
Right.
And kind of you're conferring with the GM possibly in private so that the other players can be like pleasantly surprised by this narrative development, just like the audience would be if they were watching.
Yep.
But you and the GM are on the same page. You can kind of like work together to subtly work toward that thing you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, everyone at the table is telling a story.
Right.
And it's a collaborative story. And it's never, ever, ever you versus them. It is always us together. And if everyone is behind that idea, what you'll quickly realize is everybody wants to throw things at their characters and suffer through the difficulties together and grow from that and tell this amazing story at the end and hopefully solve the mystery, conquer the bad guys, and destroy the ring. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
And so, if you collaborate with your GM to say, hey, I'm going to take my character in a direction where I'm going to become the villain or something like that. And especially if the other players, as they start to figure this out, are on board with it and they think it's cool and interesting. Just kind of that spirit of collaboration, that spirit of being willing to work with each other can really make anything possible.
Yeah, you might end up with a really cool Frodo moment. You know?
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for Season 1, Episode 6 of the Doc and Krueger cast, our discussion on character growth and development in the Roll With It system. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Bracken and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.